Zephany nurse. Raised as Mishi Solomon after being snatched from Groot Schuur Hospital in 1997. Says she knows the convicted kidnapper, who raised her, had indeed removed her from her biological mother's arms. Celeste nurse delivered Zephany on April 27, 1997 by caesarean section in the Groot Schuur Hospital, Cape Town, South Africa. Celeste described a person in a nurse's uniform comforting her while her baby was still in the nearby cot before falling asleep. When Celeste had woken up, a nurse kept asking her where the baby was, and at this point she realized that Zephany had been taken. The hospital contacted the police for assistance in searching the hospital. However, only a few untraceable items were found, including Zephany's baby nest, a baby garment, and a handbag with no identifiable items. A pillow was found in a tunnel that was intended to provide women in labor direct access to the ward from the street. The tunnel also provided access to the old main building, psychiatric department and outpatient section, which at the time had unrestricted access. The nurse family believe the kidnapper took precautions to move through the ward unnoticed. The pillow was probably used to fake a pregnancy, as no one questions a pregnant woman moving around in a maternity ward. The woman, now dressed as a nurse in maroon pants and oatmeal top, made an effort to befriend the mothers in the ward. One of the expectant mothers, who remembered the kidnapper's face, had spoken to her briefly. On another occasion, this same mother found her holding her baby, and when questioned, the woman replied that the baby had been crying and she was comforting it. In a later interview, Celeste nurse said her intention was to steal a child. She didn't care which child it was. 5 days after Zephany's birth, the nurse family went home without their daughter. Celeste nurse clung to the hope that what happened was not real, or a kind of sick joke, and that someone would bring her daughter. Every year since the kidnapping, the nurse family would celebrate Zephany's birthday on April 28, in an attempt to keep the search for her in the media. Celeste has also given a number of interviews. It was the first day of term at Swanswyk High School in Cape Town and the beginning of Mishi Solomon's final year. And that January day in 2015, 17-year-old Mishi was mobbed by other students excitedly telling her about the new girl Cassidy nurse, who was 3 years younger but looked almost identical to her. Initially, Mishi didn't think much of it. But when the two girls later met in the corridor, Mishi says she felt an instant connection she couldn't explain. "I almost felt like I knew her," she says. "It was so scary, I couldn't understand why I was feeling like this." Becoming good friends despite the 4-year age gap, they called each other Big Sis and Little Sis. People would joke and say they looked like sisters, and Mishi would reply, "Maybe in another life." What they didn't realize was that we're sisters. Growing up in a normal and happy household, Mishi felt loved by her mom and dad, Lavona and Michael Solomon, and they would speak about how much of a family resemblance she had. Her mom would talk about how on April 30, 1997, Mishi arrived into the world quickly and easily. So fast, in fact, that her dad didn't even leave work to see her born. Instead, he'd met her at home later that day, feeling safe and loved. There was no reason for Mishi to think her beloved mom was a liar. Growing closer, Mishi and Cassidy hung out together after school and, like most teens, took selfies. When she got home, Mishi's mother commented on how similar the two girls looked. Her dad said he knew Cassidy's dad as he owned an electrical store he'd been to. When Cassidy confided in Mishi that she had an older sister who'd been kidnapped from the hospital at birth, the story sounded so far-fetched Mishi wondered if she was making it up. Then one day the pair were hanging out after school when Cassidy's dad Morn came to pick her up. Seeing Mishi, he couldn't shake a strange feeling and began asking her a series of weird questions. He wanted to know what her date of birth was and what hospital she'd been born in. Then he told her that he looked like Cassidy's mom, Celeste Nurse. The next day Mishi's world imploded. Called from her math lesson into the principal's office, there were two social workers in there. She was told that Cassidy had an older sister called Zephanie Nurse who'd been stolen aged just 3 days old on April 30, 1997. They thought she was Zephanie. Detectives were at her house speaking to her parents as there was no record of Mishi's birth in the hospital where her mom said she's been born. Believing it to all to be a terrible mix-up, Mishi agreed to a DNA test to set the record straight, and she was placed in a safe house until the results could be confirmed. I had so much belief in the mother who raised me. She would never lie to me, especially about who I am and where I come from, Mishi told the BBC. So my mind was made up that the DNA test was going to be negative. Her dad was just as confused, saying, "I was there the day she came back from the hospital. I saw her." The next day Mishi's worst fears came true. "You are the Zephanie Nurse baby," she was told. Police couldn't find any evidence to suggest Michael Solomon had known about the kidnap plot, but her mom Lavona Solomon was arrested for kidnapping. "That broke me," Mishi recalls. "I needed her. I needed to ask her why. What's going on? I was so overwhelmed that I belonged to someone else. I sat there in shock. My life was out of control." That day Mishi was taken to meet Celeste and Morn, her biological parents, who were also complete strangers. Hugging them, she tried to do and say the right things so they would be able to see that she'd been raised right. "They deserved my affection, but I felt nothing." Although they'd had 3 more children, the Nurse family had never forgotten their lost little girl and had a birthday party for her every year she'd been missing. Meanwhile, she'd been growing up 5 kilometers from their house, completely unaware she'd been stolen at birth by the woman she called Mom. The kidnap of Zephanie Nurse had been huge news in South Africa, and the country was delighted she'd been found alive and safe, but Mishi was in turmoil. The Nurse family were so desperate to love her, but she didn't feel close to them like her. Unable to return home legally, she had to stay in the safe house for 3 months until she turned 18 and became old enough to make her own decisions. And after briefly considering living with Celeste or Morn, who were now divorced, she decided to go and live with Michael, the man who raised her. Lavona Solomon, 52, pleaded not guilty to kidnapping, fraud, and violating the Children's Act. She claimed she'd been handed the baby at a railway station by a woman who'd been giving her fertility treatment after a series of miscarriages. Clinical psychologist Mark Stein, who had examined the kidnapper, told the court she did not believe she had committed an offense by stealing the baby. In August 2010, Lavona was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years. "You caused so much harm to Zephanie, who for 17 years didn't know you were not her biological mother. You actually betrayed her. You had every opportunity to return the child, year in and year out," said Judge John Hloff today. Lavona Solomon is still in jail 120 kilometers away, and Mishi visits her regularly and says she forgives her. She lives with her dad Michael and her 2 kids. I hope you liked today's video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.